Today we're visiting Castell Coch. It's very famous, it's heavily visited. It's best known as a 19th century fantasy of a medieval castle. And often when we talk about it, we talk about the third Marquis of Bute, who was an incredibly rich man controlling most of the coal mining around Cardiff in South Wales. But there is actually an original castle. He didn't build this from scratch. He took an original castle which was in ruins, and we'll see that in a little while, and he repaired it, but you couldn't repair it and make it livable. So he rebuilt it as a fantasy, as a dream, as really a fever dream of Arthurian legend. He was quite a devout Catholic. He changed religion, much to his family's chagrin. And when he did that, it was at a time when Catholic churches had just been re-legalised in 1832. And particularly Pugin, as an architect, was pushing an aesthetic, a design style of Gothic architecture, very much inspired by the modern crafts and production techniques joined with the Middle Ages in terms of designs. And there's a lot of that inside. As we walk around the outside, you could just about make out the section which was originally there and was repaired, this wall round here. And particularly at the bottom, just above the rocks, you see that piece of wall? There's more underground than above ground still visible today. But the original castle was actually built by Gilbert de Clare, the 7th Earl of Gloucester, who was quite a colourful and unpleasant character. He inherited when he was still underage and became the Lord of Glamorgan, but under the ward of Humphrey de Bohun, who was the 2nd Earl of Hereford. And during the Second Baron's War in 1264, he actually led the massacre of the Jews in Canterbury. And he supported Simon de Montfort. Henry III wasn't very happy, and he took the castles that he had at Kingston and Tonbridge. Clare was denounced as a traitor. So 2 days later, 14th of May, just before the Battle of Lewes, Simon de Montfort knighted the Earl and his brother Thomas. And the Battle of Lewes was a success for them. The king was beaten back, Henry was pushed back to the Priory of St Pancras. Gilbert accepted the surrender of the Earl of Cornwall, and Montfort was effectively the de facto king of England. And Gilbert was his key supporter. Then Gilbert was excommunicated by Pope Clement IV, and his lands were placed under an interdict. But in the following month, he was off again, and he attacked Bristol, destroyed a lot of ships and a bridge of the River Severn at Gloucester, then changed sides. So when there was the Battle of Kenilworth on the 16th of July and the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August, he was on the side of Prince Edward. And Prince Edward won, was very happy. And Gilbert was given title of Abergavenny and the honour and castles of Brecknock. He began building Caerphilly in October 1265 as well. And he got a papal absolution on the 9th of October. And struck on, continuing, was a Marcher Lord responsible for the marchers, the Welsh marchers. And the Marcher Lords were very brutal and suppressed the Welsh and made a lot of money in the process. Well, 1268, he refused to obey the king's summons to attend Parliament because he said that he was so busy fighting Llewellyn Malas to maintain his Welsh estates that he had to stay for their defence. At the death of Henry III, he swiftly moved to Edward and swore fealty to Edward I, who was returning from the Crusades. By 1282, Edward was looking for expansion and he invaded Wales, and the Marcher Lords were very much at the front of that. Marcher Lords were allowed to wage their own wars in Wales. It was an effective way of expanding English power in Wales. But he took it a bit too far when he waged a war against the Earl of Hereford, Humphrey de Bohun, who you might remember was his guardian when he was underage. His only son died at the Battle of Bannockburn, and his wife died in 1307. Really, his lands drifted to other people. Castell Coch had been his hunting lodge rather than really a castle, but it does have hundreds of years of history as a result. With the Industrial Revolution and the growth of tourism at Morte d'Arthur, the tale that we now know as the Tales of King Arthur, there was a romantic love of the Middle Ages and chivalry. And when the third Marquis of Bute decided that he would like to have a summer house, effectively, a retreat, a holiday home, he bought this large piece of land, a huge forest and tried to turn it into a vision of a fairy tale. See here in the drawing room, the magnificent fireplace, the wood panelling, each panel painted with different flowers, the walls beautifully detailed, even the stone carving on the windows. It's very perpendicular and very Gothic revival. Beautiful painted sculptures of saints over the fireplace there. And the furniture even is inspired by the Middle Ages, but very much of their time, and this beautiful domed ceiling. It's just gorgeous, with all the different birds flying into the stars. You see what I mean about it being a fever dream fantasy. The architect William Burgess was commissioned to design a castle from the Middle Ages fit for an Arthurian legend. And he really didn't hold back in any single detail, from the wallpaper, the carving, the selection of paintings, the religious iconography, the imagery, the tiling there, the wood panels, the furniture. Really, the only thing which isn't almost excessive is the flooring, and even here out in the hallway you can see these beautiful tiles, very much reminiscent of a cathedral. And all of this was built on top of the ruin. You can see a red motif going through the building in terms of a lot of the doors, the woodwork, the excess detailing. And Castell Coch actually means Red Castle. So it's a hint to the name. And here you have these. So they look a lot like a staircase in a castle ruin today. But if you look closely at the way they're cut, with the frontage and then they have the top piece, it's not really like a genuine staircase. It's here where you see the hints that this is not an original castle that's been detailed. It's a complete new recreation. Here there's a toilet, which is very much of the Middle Ages. That's the private, not quite ensuite for the Lord, and this is the Lord's bedroom. Well, Marquis. And you can see the stones that have been painted painstakingly onto the wall, the beautiful glass detailing in the windows, the elaborate fireplace. All the furniture, like the dresser there, which was very much a Victorian or Edwardian. Your grandmother probably had a dresser table a bit like that. But it's styled in keeping with the overall structure, magnificently painted, whilst the bed is actually very basic and plain. He was a very wealthy man. I did have a conversation with a lady at the Museum of Cardiff who said that it was about himself rather than the local people. But he was an intensely rich man, quite religious and pious man. And he obviously had a deep appreciation of architecture and had visited a lot of castles and ruins, and there are so many in this area. There's probably 10 within about 20 minutes drive of here. And also, of course, he was heavily involved with Cardiff Castle, which fortunately we didn't have time for on this trip, but I'm sure we'll do again in the future. I love here the wash basin. If you see how it's styled, this is his wife's bedroom. It's styled as a castle, the wash basin itself. Now, apparently some of the detailing in this room he didn't approve of, and he felt that the monkeys were a bit too lewd. So they were painted out on the ceiling, and he had them repainted, these, where he felt they were a little too cheeky, and it wasn't appropriate for his wife's bedroom. And the bed is very unusual as well. We'll look at it in a minute. But this dome is just huge. Gilded, painted. Every square centimetre of it is covered in beautiful illustration. It's almost like the Natural History Museum's ceiling panels in the main hall. If you've seen the video I did on the Natural History Museum, it's very much that same design aesthetic, the Gothic revival. But it's not really very Gothic in its colours and its liveliness, just in the design elements. Then you come back out and you can walk along from his wife's bedroom, which is directly above his. I don't know whether they were or weren't sharing a room. And here, this is above the front gate. And the level of detail here was excessive. They couldn't reconstruct a castle without reconstructing a drawbridge. And this is actually the mechanism for dropping the gate and closing the front door. And it is fully working. There's the portcullis. There's the counterweight for it. Here's the mechanism for winding it. It all sits in a room above the front gate. When you come out here, it's beautiful. It's almost like Disney in its recreation of the past. It reminds me a lot of the Disney princess castles, but it's actually built to live in, not purely to be decorative. And it is a living and breathing castle, a real family home, all built around this circular courtyard. And even down there you can see the pattern in the bricks. It's really quite elaborate. One of the plainest rooms in the castles, and it's still beautifully painted. The amount of detail and the thought that's gone into this building to give it a particular aesthetic, a particular style, is quite remarkable. And other than the cellar, everything is pretty heavily detailed. And the Marquis put in years of thought on this. Like, we'll get to the chapel in a while. The chapel was rebuilt numerous times and was only actually in place for a few months before it was taken down. Now here we see some interesting signs about the history of the area, the vineyard. He put one of the first vineyards in Britain here, and he actually wrote to vineyards in France trying to get master winemakers to come to Castell Coch. And no matter how much money he offered them, they found it risible that someone would grow grapes in South Wales. So they all refused, and he sent one of his most trusted servants to, well, let's say staff, to become an expert and come back, and he planted 3 vineyards. The one at Castell Coch is now a golf course. We're now at the top of this tower. Unfortunately, it's all under scaffolding, so you can't see the magnificent views over the dense forest. But you can see here even the detailing on these window covers, or they're not really window covers, they're covers for the castellation. Because by the time this castle was built, you didn't need permission from the king to have castellation. And they're very impressive from the outside. Again, you can see they're not actually as authentic. They're visually authentic in that they're too big. They expose you too much to attack if you were to stand at them. But you have the slits and you have the castellation. You have these beautiful covers. And built all around this bit is a wooden shelter on the outside, which all red detailed. So you constantly have this red motif of the red castle the whole way round, along with the ironwork on top of this stonework. It's very Victorian, not Middle Ages. But it's easy to look at the castle for a short while and think of it as an amazing survivor of the Middle Ages. Now this room, the chapel was completely demolished. It was taken off the structure. It actually hung from the highest tower with 2/3 of it out in the air. And it's not really documented why, but it was taken down. And the only thing that left were 20 stained glass windows of saints. And half of them are still here in this room. And they're quite beautiful. You can see very good examples of 19th century stained glass. And this is actually the dome at the top of the tower. The room inside the roof, this attic almost. And they're very beautiful lit from behind. It's hard to really do them justice with the video camera. But I did get some snaps on my camera, so I'm sure I'll put them on Instagram. You can see there, we're inside that the pointy bit at the top and the tower, the roof. And you can see the chapel stuck out of the side. And here the covered walkway inside the castle above the courtyard links you between all of the rooms and helps you walk between the towers. And they really are quite striking. And not as non-Welsh as you might think, in that you do get castles like this. It's almost a bit Germanic, the pointed roofs on top of the castle towers. Actually, you do see them a few round here. Some of the later post-Norman castles. But it's very striking and beautiful building. And well worth a visit. If you're an English Heritage member, it's actually free if you've been a member for more than a year. Along with all of the Welsh Heritage Cadw. I'm sure I'm murdering the pronunciation of that. Upstairs there to his daughter's room. And this house was used as a summer house, a weekend getaway, and then later on it was used when members of the family were sick, if they were contagious. they'd be bought here and they'd live here for a few weeks until they weren't contagious. And this is the bedroom. Slightly strange. It's one of the plainest, and you do get a feeling when you're here that his poor daughter, when they were here, was in a tower by herself in a dark, cold castle overlooking the woods in a very austere room. And although it's beautiful and detailed, and she obviously lived a very gilded life, it's quite a strange room for a child. Imagine being, say, 12 or 14, and your parents are like, okay, you're off to your room in the smaller tower at the other side of the castle. It would be a very cold place, even if it has this ingle nook. And I don't mean cold in temperature, just it's very austere and basic. There's no teddy bears and unicorns here, whereas you compare it to the parents' bedrooms, which are alive with imagery. This is a very plain, utilitarian room by comparison. And again, the furniture, IKEA it's not. It's very much, this is a modern version of what we would have had in the Middle Ages. I mean, in the room below, there's a kitchen. And they project different types of food that would have been eaten here at different meals onto the plates there from a projector hung from the ceiling, which doesn't come across on the video at all, but is quite nice when you're there. But again, these huge high ceilings, very Gothic revival church architecture in terms of the arches, the tiling, even the detailing of the metalwork on the doors. It's a very striking castle. And really what he set out to achieve, I would say he achieved. It's a beautiful reimagining of a medieval castle without the austerity of the post-Reformation, where the plastered walls have been whitewashed. There's a lovely model here of Castell Coch when it was built, and they're projecting a drone video of the castle. Sadly, drones are very much frowned upon on structures like this, particularly Cadwell Welsh Heritage. They don't like it and make that very clear, and I only drone where you're allowed to, or public land. And this is very much at the top of a hill where there isn't really any public land too close. There's some interesting pieces for children here. You can play at reconstructing the heating system. And you can see the difference with these stone steps. Although they're not the winding steps of a round tower, you can immediately see that they've been cut and laid very differently. They've been dressed differently. And when you descend here down into the storage rooms, this is actually the original prison cell. And there's a joke skeleton skull in the corner. So the walls here are original. The vaulted ceiling, or the arched ceiling, has been recreated with brick during the reconstruction. Here's the heating system that you can rebuild, because this was all actually heated. It wasn't quite as cold as it might look. You can catch a view of the radiator in the corner there on my right. And there's a little model there that kids can build a reconstruction. I'd say it's very good at covering the Marquis of Bute. And you can see the architectural achievements of William Burgess. even here, the beautiful arched ceiling. It reminds me of a chapter house in a Norman priory or abbey. And actually the floor below has the same approach to the ceiling. It's not an exotic folly, is what their website says about it. It's actually a mock medieval trappings laid across a 13th century castle. I would describe it more as a fevered imagination, a dream of a medieval castle constructed out of the ruins. Here in this original storage room downstairs, they've got a suggestion that the wine was probably stored there, using it as a cellar, so they have some mock barrels, but apparently it was very good wine. And the wine that he grew here was actually precursor to the modern wine industry in the UK, because it had always been thought it was too cold and never hot enough for the grapes. There's a lovely little shop in the corner there. And all these alcoves have benches in. You can sit and enjoy the view or take a rest after the towers. Or if you've walked up the hill, I have to say, you can get a bus to the bottom and walk up, but you'd certainly hope you've got a car. It's quite a steep, long hill. So if you do walk up, you'll be wanting a seat at the top there. Here, just a little spin around the courtyard. You can see it's gorgeous, beautiful, and it's still livable. It feels like the Lord rode out in his carriage a few days ago, and it's waiting for the Marquis of Bute's return for his family's summer house. And what a summer house. Gives you a hint of the wealth that he had. I hope you enjoyed our visit to Castell Coch. We're going to be visiting quite a few other castles in this area. There's the three castles, which were all owned by one lord, and actually only two were castles. We're going to be visiting Castell Raglan, which really is a masterpiece. Beautiful, beautiful building. Chepstow Castle, a very large defensive position on the River Wye, which was one of the inspirations of the first tourist book for the UK. And also we're going to be visiting places like the Roman fort and Roman town of Caerleon and Caerwent, two different places. So there's a lot in this part of South Wales, and eventually we'll get to Caerphilly, which is, well, it was built in its original form by the Marcher Lord who built this castle. But after it was destroyed by the Welsh, it was rebuilt as a metal fist to make it very clear that it wasn't going to be demolished again. So it was one of the ring of castles around Wales that kept the Welsh in their place under Norman rule. You can see here the post holes for the scaffolding are quite interesting, because you do see that on older castles where there were holes to put the scaffolding on for the structure, and then when the scaffolding was taken down, they were left exposed. But that wasn't needed here. But the Marquis of Bute added them anyway, because every detail was essential. He didn't want a Disney castle. He wanted a real, in speech marks, castle. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Please do subscribe. It does help a lot and helps you see our other videos. We'll be doing quite a few from this area, as I said. And every Monday there's a museum tour. And on Saturday, an Unbound history like this, where we try to look at a place in terms of the history and tales that happened there.